Hi everyone, welcome back. I hope you're all doing well. Today I want to argue that Eric Cartman is one of the most psychologically disturbing characters in the history of animation. And I don't mean disturbing in a cheap shock value sort of way. I mean disturbing because when you actually sit down and examine his behavior through real clinical and psychological frameworks, what you find is a character whose patterns mirror actual diagnosable conditions, actual personality disorders, and actual cycles of abuse that psychologists have spent decades studying. Now, on the surface, Cartman is a joke. He's a fat kid in a small town in Colorado who says horrible things and gets into absurd situations. That's the surface level reading, and for a lot of people, that's enough. But South Park has been on the air since 1997. It was created by Trey Parker and Matt Stone. And as of now, Trey Parker alone has been credited as writer on over 325 episodes across 28 seasons. That is a staggering body of work. And across all those years, Cartman has evolved from a crude punchline into something much more layered and much more uncomfortable. What I want to do in this video is take Cartman seriously as a psychological subject. I want to examine him through the lens of the dark triad personality model, through the clinical criteria for conduct disorder and antisocial personality disorder, through research on permissive parenting and narcissistic development, and through the specific episodes that reveal the machinery underneath his behavior. By the end, I think you'll see Cartman differently, not just as a cartoon villain, but as one of the most accurate depictions of how a certain kind of person actually operates in the real world. And the reason that matters, the reason it's worth spending this much time on a fictional 10-year-old, is that the traits Cartman exaggerates for comedy exist in smaller and quieter forms in people you've probably met. Maybe people you've worked with. Maybe people you've been in relationships with. Understanding how those traits function, how they develop, and what they cost isn't just an academic exercise. It's genuinely useful knowledge for navigating the world. But before we get into all of that, I just want to kindly ask you to subscribe. It's completely free, and it really helps us improve the videos for this community we've been building. Anyway, that's enough housekeeping. Let's get into it. So to understand Cartman psychologically, the best place to start is with a framework called the dark triad. This is a model of personality that was first published in 2002 by two researchers named Delroy Polhus and Kevin Williams. They identified three distinct but overlapping personality types that they described as dark because each one contains qualities that are considered malevolent. Those three types are Machiavellianism, narcissism, and psychopathy. Now, these aren't the same as clinical diagnoses. You won't find dark triad listed in the DSM. What the dark triad describes is a cluster of personality traits that tend to show up together, that overlap in significant ways, and that are associated with what researchers call a callous and manipulative interpersonal style. In other words, people who score high on all three tend to treat other humans as tools to be used, obstacles to be removed, or audiences to be performed for. They don't engage with other people the way emotionally healthy individuals do. Let's break down each trait and then look at how Cartman embodies all three simultaneously, because that's where things get genuinely interesting. The first trait is Machiavellianism. This is named after Niccolò Machiavelli, the Italian political philosopher who wrote The Prince, a book that essentially argued that rulers should be willing to use deception, manipulation, and strategic cruelty to maintain power. In psychological terms, Machiavellianism is defined as a personality characterized by manipulativeness, indifference to morality, lack of empathy, and a calculated focus on self-interest. The key word there is calculated. A Machiavellian person doesn't just do harmful things impulsively. They plan, they anticipate other people's reactions, they set up situations where they win no matter what the other person does. They think several moves ahead, like a chess player, except the pieces are other people's lives. Cartman is arguably the purest example of Machiavellianism in all of fiction. And the episode that proves it beyond any doubt is Scott Tenorman Must Die from Season 5. This is widely considered the darkest episode in the show's history, and it's the episode that permanently changed how both the audience and the other characters understood what Cartman was capable of. Here's what happens. Cartman buys pubic hair from an older kid named Scott Tenorman for $10, thinking this means he's reached puberty. When Stan and Kyle explain that you grow your own pubes and don't buy them, Cartman tries to get his money back, but Scott outsmarts him at every turn. He tricks Cartman out of even more money, humiliates him publicly, and eventually forces Cartman to dance like a pig before burning the $16.12 right in front of him. It seems like a straightforward story of a bully getting bullied by someone smarter and older, and normally that would be where it ends. But Cartman doesn't accept defeat. He goes quiet, which is the most dangerous thing Cartman can do. He begins crafting a plan that accounts for variables that nobody else even considers. He invites the band Radiohead to come to South Park by writing them a letter claiming Scott Tenorman is a dying fan. He trains one of Farmer Denkin's ponies to attack. He sets up a chili cook-off as the public venue for his revenge, and here's where the Machiavellianism becomes genuinely chilling. He anticipates that Stan and Kyle will betray him. He knows his own friends will warn Scott about the pony. He builds that betrayal into his plan. He warns Farmer Denkins that violent pony killers have been spotted in the area, knowing that Denkins shoots trespassers on sight. He predicts that Scott won't go to the ranch himself, that Scott will send his parents instead, and that is exactly what happens. Denkins sees Scott's parents on his property, shoots and kills both of them, and Cartman arrives at the scene just in time to steal the bodies. He spends that night with a hacksaw. He grinds them into chili. And at the cook-off the next day, he feeds that chili to Scott Tenorman, then reveals everything in front of the entire town. Scott reaches into the bowl and pulls out his own mother's finger with a diamond ring on it. He vomits, he sobs, and Cartman climbs up on the table and sings a mocking song. Then Radiohead arrives on schedule, sees Scott crying, calls him a crybaby, totally not cool, and leaves. And Cartman licks the tears off of Scott's face and calls them the tears of unfathomable sadness. This is not the behavior of a child throwing a tantrum. This is strategic, premeditated, multi-layered psychological warfare. He predicted his friend's betrayal, exploited a farmer's paranoia, engineered the death of 2 people, desecrated their corpses, committed an act of forced cannibalism, and timed a celebrity appearance to maximize emotional devastation. That is Machiavellianism taken to its absolute extreme. The second trait in the dark triad is narcissism. In psychology, narcissism is characterized by grandiosity, pride, egotism, and a fundamental lack of empathy. Narcissistic individuals have an inflated sense of their own importance that is typically not supported by reality. They believe they are special, entitled to admiration and resources, and deserving of treatment that other people don't receive. When that inflated self-image is threatened, they react with what psychologists call narcissistic rage, a response that is disproportionate to the actual threat and that can involve extreme hostility, cruelty, or vindictiveness. Cartman's narcissism is evident in virtually every episode, but one of the clearest examples comes from the season 15 episode TMI. The school conducts annual physicals and posts a chart in the hallway showing how much each student has grown in height since the previous year. Cartman sees this list and immediately interprets it as a ranking of penis sizes. He's at the bottom of the list, which he finds personally devastating. Without pausing to verify his interpretation, he measures every penis himself and posts his own findings in the hall. When the principal explains that the list was about height, not anatomy, Cartman discovers that his penis actually is the smallest in the school, which makes the whole ordeal even worse. But here's where the narcissism becomes genuinely dangerous. He's sent to a psychiatrist who tries to assess his anger by making fat jokes and insults. Cartman shows no visible reaction during the session. He sits there calmly while, in silence, he uses his phone to fabricate chat logs and a fake police report suggesting the psychiatrist had an inappropriate relationship. The psychiatrist's wife receives this information, calls her husband, and takes her own life while on the phone with him. Cartman's only response is to tell the horrified psychiatrist his catchphrase about being big bone. That is narcissistic rage channeled through Machiavellian planning. His self-image was threatened by a perceived slight about his body. His response was to destroy another person's entire life, deliberately and without remorse. The threat didn't have to be real, it just had to be perceived because for a narcissist, the perception of disrespect is the same as actual disrespect, and the response must be overwhelming enough to restore the narcissist's sense of superiority. A 2025 psychological analysis published on Zimbardo.com described Cartman as displaying narcissistic personality traits, including grandiosity, entitlement, and lack of empathy, noting that despite his outward confidence, Cartman harbors underlying insecurities, particularly related to social status and acceptance, and that his aggressive behavior can be viewed as defensive mechanisms to mask feelings of inadequacy or vulnerability. That analysis captures something essential about Cartman. The narcissism isn't strength, it's armor. It's a 10-year-old who cannot tolerate feeling small, so he makes everyone around him feel smaller. The third trait is psychopathy, which is characterized by continuous antisocial behavior, impulsivity, selfishness, callous and unemotional traits, and a complete absence of remorse. Now, there's an important distinction between psychopathy as a personality construct and antisocial personality disorder as a clinical diagnosis, and we'll get into the clinical side in a moment. But in terms of the dark triad framework, psychopathy describes someone who engages in harmful behavior repeatedly, feels no guilt about it, and cannot form genuine emotional bonds with other people. Cartman fits this pattern with almost clinical precision. Across 28 seasons, he has caused deaths directly and indirectly, manipulated his closest companions for personal gain, exploited vulnerable people, including disabled children and crack-addicted babies, engaged in acts of cruelty for entertainment rather than necessity, and shown virtually no sustained remorse for any of it. On the rare occasions when Cartman appears to feel something approaching guilt, the show typically reveals that this is either a temporary fluctuation that reverts immediately or another manipulation designed to gain sympathy. What makes Cartman particularly interesting from a dark triad perspective is the way all three traits interact. Research by Paul Huss and Williams found that all three dark triad traits correlate strongly with low agreeableness in the Big Five personality model. They also found that while the traits overlap, they are distinct enough to produce different behavioral patterns depending on which trait is dominant in a given situation. Cartman shifts between modes depending on what the situation requires. When he needs to plan and manipulate, the Machiavellianism takes over. When his ego is threatened, the narcissism drives his response. When he encounters suffering or consequences, the psychopathic detachment allows him to move on without processing what he's done. And here's the thing that makes Cartman more realistic than most fictional villains. He's not consistent. Real people with dark triad traits aren't either. They don't act like movie villains who are sinister in every scene. They're funny sometimes, they're charming sometimes. They can be generous when it serves them, they can be loyal when the cost is low. And then, when circumstances align, they do something so disproportionately cruel that the people around them are left stunned, wondering how the same person could have been laughing with them 5 minutes earlier. That's Cartman. That's how the dark triad actually operates in real human behavior. The show captures it better than most psychological dramas do, and it does it through a cartoon child in a red jacket. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Understanding Cartman's personality traits gives us the framework, but to really see how deep his psychology goes, we need to look at the clinical diagnoses that his behavior maps onto, starting with a childhood condition that is formally recognized in the DSM, and that serves as the developmental gateway to something much more serious. Now, before I go any further, I want to be clear about something. Eric Cartman is a fictional character. He cannot be clinically diagnosed. No therapist is going to sit him down in an office and hand him a DSM evaluation. But what we can do, and what makes this exercise genuinely useful, is compare his behavioral patterns to real clinical criteria and see how closely they align. And when you do that with Cartman, the alignment is uncomfortably precise. The condition I want to start with is called conduct disorder. This is a real diagnosis listed in the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders published by the American Psychiatric Association. Conduct disorder is specifically a childhood and adolescent diagnosis. It describes a repetitive and persistent pattern of behavior in which the basic rights of others or major age-appropriate norms are violated. According to the DSM-5, there are 4 categories of behavior that define conduct disorder, containing 15 specific criteria in total, and a child needs to display at least 3 of those 15 criteria within a 12-month period, with at least one present in the past 6 months. Those 4 categories are aggression to people and animals, destruction of property, deceitfulness or theft, and serious violation of rules. Let me walk through each one and show you how Cartman maps onto them, because it's almost eerie how well he fits. The first category is aggression to people and animals. According to Yale Medicine's Clinical Overview of Conduct Disorder, children with this condition may be physically aggressive to other children or adults. They may bully, threaten, or intimidate others. In serious cases, they may use weapons or engage in behaviors that could cause physical harm. Cartman has physically assaulted other children throughout the series. He has bullied virtually every peer he interacts with. He has used weapons, including a taser he stole from his mother and a Glock pistol he carries around in later seasons. And as we've already discussed in detail, his actions in the Scott Tenorman episode resulted in the deaths of 2 people and the forced cannibalism of their remains. The aggression category is not even close. Cartman exceeds it by several orders of magnitude. The second category is destruction of property. The DSM-5 specifies deliberate destruction of others' property, which can include fire setting with the intention of causing serious damage. Cartman engages in property destruction repeatedly throughout the series. In the Caesar Millen episode from season 10, when his mother attempts to enforce discipline with the help of the dog whisperer, Cartman's immediate response is to destroy Butter's room with a baseball bat. He doesn't destroy his own property, he destroys someone else's, someone who isn't even involved in the conflict, because destroying things that belong to others is how he expresses the rage he feels when his autonomy is threatened. This is a consistent pattern. When Cartman is thwarted, things get broken, and they're usually things that belong to other people. The third category is deceitfulness or theft. The DSM-5 describes this as frequently lying or breaking promises to obtain goods or favors, or to avoid obligations, as well as stealing items without confronting the victim. Cartman's entire existence is built on deceit. In Up the Down Steroid from season 8, he fakes being disabled in order to compete in the Special Olympics and win the $1,000 prize money. He undergoes an elaborate training montage to convincingly pretend to be handicapped, including reading books on disability, riding the special education bus while taking notes, cutting his hair badly, studying a Kid Rock performance for mannerisms, modifying his shoes to simulate a club foot, and putting on a bicycle helmet so tightly that his face becomes deformed. He then manipulates his own mother into signing him up by giving her a tearful speech about wanting to understand how disabled children face their challenges. Every single part of this is a lie, constructed with effort and maintained with commitment, for the sole purpose of exploiting vulnerable people for money. That is textbook deceitfulness as defined by the clinical criteria. The fourth category is serious violation of rules. This includes behaviors like staying out late despite parental prohibitions, running away from home, and being truant from school, beginning before age 13. Cartman routinely defies every authority figure in his life. His mother, his teachers, law enforcement, school administrators, none of them have any meaningful control over his behavior. He doesn't just break rules occasionally the way normal children do. He treats the existence of rules as a personal offense. Authority is something to be circumvented, exploited, or destroyed, never respected or obeyed. So Cartman meets all 4 categories of conduct disorder criteria, and he does so with the kind of severity and persistence that the DSM-5 associates with what it calls the childhood onset type, meaning symptoms that appear before age 10. According to the DSM-5, children with childhood onset conduct disorder tend to show more physical aggression, more disturbed peer relationships, and are more likely to develop antisocial personality disorder as adults. The DSM-5 also includes a specifier for what it calls limited prosocial emotions, which describes children who show at least 2 of the following traits persistently over at least 12 months. Lack of remorse or guilt, callous lack of empathy, unconcerned about performance, and shallow or deficient affect, meaning they don't express emotions in ways that seem genuine. Cartman checks every single one of these boxes. Now here's why this matters beyond just labeling a cartoon character. Conduct disorder is not just a description, it's a predictor. According to clinical data from the NCBI Stat Pearls reference in Yale Medicine, approximately 25 to 40% of children and adolescents diagnosed with conduct disorder go on to develop antisocial personality disorder as adults. Antisocial personality disorder, or ASPD, is the adult version of what we're looking at with Cartman, and it's one of the most treatment-resistant conditions in all of psychiatry. The American Psychiatric Association notes that ASPD is typically a lifelong condition, and that while some patients show improvement with age, particularly regarding reduced impulsivity and aggressiveness, many remain symptomatic and some never improve. The pipeline from conduct disorder to antisocial personality disorder is one of the most well-documented trajectories in clinical psychology. And Cartman, even as a fictional child, sits squarely at the beginning of that pipeline. Everything about his behavior suggests that without meaningful intervention, which the show consistently demonstrates he will never receive, he is on a direct path toward becoming the kind of adult who causes serious harm to the people around him for his entire life. And that brings us to something I find genuinely fascinating about how the show uses its characters, because Cartman doesn't exist in isolation. He has a foil. He has someone whose psychology reveals his own by contrast. And that person is Kyle Broflovsky. The relationship between Cartman and Kyle is the most psychologically rich dynamic in the entire series, and understanding it requires understanding what Kyle represents to Cartman on a deeper level than just rivalry or annoyance. Kyle is Cartman's primary psychological target, and Cartman needs him in a way that goes beyond simple hatred. This is something the show itself addresses directly. In multiple episodes, when Kyle is absent or in danger, Cartman's behavior changes, not because he misses Kyle in any emotional sense, but because without Kyle, Cartman loses his primary source of what psychologists who study narcissism call narcissistic supply. Narcissistic supply is the attention, both positive and negative, that a narcissistic person requires from others in order to maintain their inflated self-image. For Cartman, Kyle is the person who reacts most strongly, most emotionally, and most predictably to his provocations. Kyle argues back. Kyle gets angry, Kyle tries to stop him, and every one of those reactions feeds Cartman's sense of power and importance. There's an episode where Cartman actually saves Kyle's life, and the show makes it explicitly clear that he doesn't do this out of compassion or affection. He does it because without Kyle, he has nobody to torment. His identity as the dominant, superior figure in their dynamic requires Kyle's presence as the reactive, frustrated counterpart. Without the target, the weapon has no purpose. This dynamic mirrors patterns that psychologists observe in real abusive relationships, where the abuser doesn't want the victim to leave, not because they love the victim, but because the victim serves a psychological function. The victim is the person against whom the abuser defines themselves. They need someone to feel superior to, someone whose reactions confirm their power, and Kyle fills that role for Cartman perfectly. The Cartmanland episode from Season 5 illustrates this dynamic with surprising precision. Cartman inherits $1 million from his grandmother and uses it to buy an amusement park called North Park Funland. His stated goal is to own a park all to himself so he never has to wait in lines. He explicitly bans Stan and Kyle from the park, and even runs a television advertisement announcing that nobody will be allowed in, especially Stan and Kyle. The show frames this as Cartman achieving his dream of total exclusion and self-gratification. But here's what's psychologically revealing. Kyle's response to Cartman's good fortune is a stress-induced hemorrhoid that becomes increasingly severe as Cartman's happiness increases. Kyle ends up in the hospital. He denounces his faith. He tells his parents he no longer believes in God because the universe rewards terrible people and punishes good ones. Kyle's psychological and physical health deteriorates in direct proportion to Cartman's success. And the show plays this out to its logical conclusion. Cartman eventually loses the park because running a business requires employees, employees require payment, and payment requires customers, which means Cartman has to let people in, which defeats the entire purpose of owning the park for himself. He loses everything. And Kyle's hemorrhoid heals. His faith returns. His health improves. The show presents this as cosmic justice, but it's also a demonstration of how deeply Cartman and Kyle are psychologically entangled. Kyle's well-being is inversely proportional to Cartman's success, and both of them seem trapped in that dynamic. The Passion of the Jew from Season 8 takes the Cartman and Kyle relationship into darker territory. After watching The Passion of the Christ, Cartman becomes convinced that the film validates his existing anti-Semitic beliefs and begins organizing followers. He dresses in what resembles a uniform and leads his group through the streets, marching and chanting in a scene that deliberately evokes historical persecution. Kyle is specifically and personally targeted. Cartman isn't just being casually bigoted, which is his baseline. He's weaponizing a cultural narrative to attack the person whose suffering gives him the most satisfaction. What makes the Cartman and Kyle dynamic psychologically interesting rather than just unpleasant is that Kyle keeps engaging. He doesn't walk away. He doesn't cut Cartman out of his life. He keeps arguing, keeps fighting, keeps trying to convince Cartman that he's wrong or to stop the latest scheme. And this is something that researchers who study narcissistic abuse have documented extensively. The target of narcissistic behavior often remains engaged long after a healthy person would have left because the narcissist is skilled at creating dynamics where disengagement feels impossible. Cartman provokes Kyle into reactions that Kyle can't control. And those reactions keep Kyle locked into the dynamic. Kyle's role in the show is also that of the moral voice. He's the one who points out when something is wrong, when Cartman has gone too far, when the group is making a mistake. But his moral objections rarely change the outcome. Cartman usually gets what he wants, at least temporarily, and Kyle is left frustrated, angry, and impotent. This is the show's quiet commentary on the relationship between ethical behavior and power. Being right doesn't mean being effective. Having moral clarity doesn't protect you from people who operate without morality. Kyle is consistently right about Cartman, and it consistently doesn't matter. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. The Cartman and Kyle dynamic shows us how Cartman operates in relationships. But to understand why he operates this way, we need to look at where it all started, at the person who raised him, and at the specific parenting patterns that psychological research has linked to the development of exactly the kind of traits we've been discussing. Leanne Cartman is one of the most important characters in South Park, and most people don't realize it. She's not important because of what she does. She's important because of what she doesn't do. She is the single biggest reason Eric Cartman became the person he is, and the show knows it, and the psychology backs it up. Leanne is a single mother. She is depicted throughout the series as extremely permissive, excessively indulgent, and fundamentally incapable of maintaining boundaries with her son. She gives Cartman whatever he wants. She rarely says no. When she does say no, she reverses herself almost immediately if Cartman pushes back with any force at all. She doesn't discipline him in any meaningful or consistent way. She treats him less like a child she's responsible for raising, and more like a companion she's trying to keep happy. And the result of this parenting approach is, well, Eric Cartman. Now, I want to connect this to real research because Leanne isn't just a comedy character. She's a nearly perfect illustration of a parenting style that psychologists have studied extensively and linked directly to the development of narcissistic and antisocial traits in children. In 1969, a psychologist named Theodore Millon proposed a theory within the social learning framework that excessive parental indulgence and approval are responsible for the development of narcissistic tendencies in children. His argument was that when parents consistently overvalue their child, fail to set boundaries, and prioritize the child's immediate happiness over long-term development, the child internalizes a sense of entitlement and specialness that is not grounded in reality. They come to believe they deserve more than other people, that rules apply to others but not to them, and that the world should arrange itself around their desires. This theory has been tested and supported by subsequent research. In 2015, a research team led by Eddie Brummelman published a longitudinal study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that specifically examined the relationship between what they called parental overvaluation and the development of narcissism in late childhood. Parental overvaluation is exactly what it sounds like. It's parents who believe and communicate that their child is more special, more entitled, and more deserving than other children. Brummelman's team found that parental overvaluation significantly predicted higher levels of narcissism in children over time. The parents weren't producing confident kids, they were producing entitled ones. A 2023 systematic review by Kilikaya, Ukar, and Danishi Nazligul, published in Psychological Reports, examined the relationship between parenting styles and narcissism from the framework established by developmental psychologist Diana Baumrind. Their conclusion was clear. Perceived permissive parenting was positively correlated with narcissism. Children who grew up with parents who were high in warmth but low in boundaries and discipline were more likely to develop narcissistic traits as they matured. And in 2024, a narrative review indexed in PubMed Central examined childhood overgratification and narcissistic personality disorder specifically. That review found that excessive complacency in parenting creates the basis of entitlement, selfishness, and an inability to tolerate rejection or lack of attention. It also found that this style of parenting prevents the development of empathy and caring for the feelings and emotions of others. Now read that last sentence again. Excessive complacency creates entitlement, selfishness, inability to tolerate rejection, and prevents the development of empathy. That is not a description of a parenting style. That is a description of Eric Cartman. Every single trait listed there is a defining characteristic of his personality, and every single one can be traced back to how Leon raised him. The episode that examines this most directly is from season 10. In this episode, Cartman's behavior has become so unmanageable that Leanne brings in a series of experts to help, culminating in the appearance of Caesar Millen, the real-life dog whisperer. Millen applies his animal training techniques to Cartman, and the show presents this completely straight. He teaches Leanne to be dominant. He teaches her to set boundaries. He teaches her to enforce consequences consistently. And it works. Cartman, faced with consistent discipline for what appears to be the first time in his life, begins to change. He starts doing homework. He eats healthy meals. He behaves appropriately. The show even includes a scene where Cartman appears to vomit out a black fluid that might represent his inner evil. And he passes out on the floor after what seems like an internal battle between his two selves. The next morning, he's a different kid. He's polite. He's cooperative. He's doing the things a healthy 10-year-old should be doing. And for a brief moment, the show suggests that genuine psychological change is possible for someone like Cartman if the environment around them changes first. But then Caesar Millen leaves, and the moment he's gone, Leanne reverts. She invites Cartman to go see Madame Butterfly with her, as if they're friends rather than parent and child. She offers to buy him a Mega Ranger toy if he comes. He asks if he can have two. She says he can have whatever he wants. And the episode ends with Cartman's face returning to its familiar, sinister expression, his old self fully restored. The psychological lesson here is devastating, and it's backed by the research. Cartman's pathology is not a fixed trait that exists independently of his environment. It is actively maintained and reinforced by the environment he lives in. When that environment changes, when consistent boundaries are enforced, when authority is exercised with calm dominance, his behavior changes. But the environment has to stay changed. Individual psychological change cannot survive if the system that produced the problem remains intact. Leanne is the system. And Leanne cannot change because Leanne has her own psychological needs that Cartman's dependence on her fulfills. There's another dimension to Cartman's family situation that makes things even more complicated. For most of the series, the identity of Cartman's father is a mystery. His mother initially claims to be both his mother and father, which is its own kind of absurdity. But the show eventually reveals the truth in the two-part episodes 200 and 201 from season 14. It turns out that Jack Tenorman, a former Denver Bronco, had an affair with Leanne Cartman, and that Jack Tenorman is Cartman's biological father. The implications of this revelation are staggering when you consider what happened in Scott Tenorman Must Die. Jack Tenorman is also Scott Tenorman's father, which means Scott Tenorman is Cartman's half-brother. Which means that when Cartman engineered the death of Scott's parents, he was unknowingly engineering the death of his own biological father. And when he ground those bodies into chili and fed them to Scott, he was feeding his half-brother their shared father. The show plays Cartman's reaction to this revelation perfectly. He doesn't grieve the fact that he killed his own father. He doesn't process the horror of what he's done. He grieves the fact that having a ginger-haired half-brother means he might be half-ginger himself. The information about patricide passes through his consciousness without generating any emotional response at all, because the narcissistic wound of potentially having red hair genes is more psychologically threatening to him than the reality of having killed his own parent. That absent-father dynamic is significant from a developmental psychology perspective. Research has consistently shown that father absence is associated with increased behavioral problems in children, particularly boys, and particularly in the areas of aggression, rule violation, and difficulty with authority. When you combine father absence with the kind of extreme permissive parenting Leanne provides, you get an environment that is essentially optimized for producing exactly the traits Cartman displays. No boundaries, no consequences, no male authority figure, unlimited indulgence, and a mother who meets the child's every demand while failing to prepare him for a world that will not. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Understanding Cartman's family environment explains how his psychology developed. But to see those traits in their most extreme expression, we need to return to the episode we discussed earlier and examine it more closely. Because Scott Tenorman Must Die isn't just Cartman's darkest moment. It's the episode that revealed something that had been there all along, but that nobody, including the characters in the show, had fully recognized. Let's talk about what Scott Tenorman Must Die really means as a psychological event. Because I covered the plot earlier, but I didn't fully explore what the episode reveals about the architecture of Cartman's mind. The first thing to understand is scale. Everything else Cartman had done before this episode was, by comparison, small. Petty schemes, selfish manipulations, casual cruelty. These were the behaviors of a badly raised child acting out his entitlement and aggression in ways that were harmful but limited in scope. Scott Tenorman Must Die represents something different. It represents the moment when Cartman's Machiavellian intelligence, his narcissistic rage at being humiliated, and his psychopathic detachment from the suffering of others all converge into a single, coherent action. Think about what the plan required. He needed to predict that Stan and Kyle, his supposed friends, would betray him. And he was right. He needed to predict that Scott would not go to Farmer Denkin's ranch himself. And he was right. He needed to predict that Scott would send his parents instead. And he was right. He needed to know that Denkins would shoot first and ask questions later. And he was right. Every step of the plan depended on Cartman having an accurate model of how other people think and behave, and at every step, his model was correct. This is what makes it psychologically significant. Cartman is not lacking in social understanding. He's not autistic or socially impaired in the way that might explain his behavior as a deficit of perception. He understands other people extremely well. He knows what they'll do. He knows what motivates them. He knows their weaknesses and their predictable responses. The problem isn't that he can't understand people. The problem is that he understands them perfectly and uses that understanding to cause harm. That is the Machiavellian component operating at full capacity. His social cognition is intact. His moral cognition is absent. The second thing to notice is the emotional response, or more accurately, the absence of one. After revealing the chili's contents, after watching Scott vomit and sob, Cartman's emotional state is pure euphoria. He climbs on the table and sings. He licks the tears off Scott's face and savors them. He is experiencing pleasure derived directly from another person's maximum suffering. This is not anger, which would at least be an emotional response proportionate to the original slight. This is sadistic joy, the experience of pleasure specifically because another person is in agony. Some researchers have proposed that sadism should be considered a fourth element of the dark triad, making it what they call the dark tetrad. Their argument is that while the dark triad traits predict harmful behavior motivated by self-interest, sadism predicts something additional, which is harmful behavior motivated by the pleasure of causing harm itself. The harm is not a means to an end. The harm is the end. And Cartman's behavior in the Scott Tenorman episode fits the sadism criterion perfectly. He didn't need to lick Scott's tears. He didn't need to sing a mocking song. He didn't need to have Radiohead there to compound the humiliation. Those elements weren't part of the strategic plan. They were pure indulgence in another person's devastation. The third thing to notice is how the other characters respond, because their reactions tell us something important about how extreme antisocial behavior affects the people who witness it. Stan and Kyle, who are Cartman's closest companions, stand in the crowd looking absolutely horrified. Kyle says to Stan that it would probably be best for everybody to never piss Cartman off again, and Stan immediately agrees. These are not characters who approve of what's happened. These are characters who are now afraid of someone they see every day, someone they sit next to in school, someone they share a bus stop with. The episode fundamentally alters the power dynamic of the entire friend group. Before Scott Tenorman, the other boys tolerated Cartman as an annoying but manageable presence. After Scott Tenorman, they know what he's capable of, and that knowledge introduces fear into every subsequent interaction. This is how antisocial individuals often gain and maintain influence in real social groups. They don't have to be violent or extreme in every interaction. They just need to demonstrate once that they are capable of going further than anyone around them is willing to go. After that single demonstration, the implicit threat does the work. People comply, accommodate, and avoid confrontation, not because the antisocial individual is always being threatening, but because everyone remembers what happened when they were. The last thing I want to point out about this episode is the reveal in 200 and 201 that Jack Tenorman was Cartman's biological father. When Scott Tenorman returns years later and forces the town to reveal this information, Cartman learns that he arranged the murder of his own father and served him in chili form to his half-brother. And Cartman's response, as I mentioned, is not horror at what he's done. It's distress about being half ginger. But Mitch Connor, the imaginary personality on Cartman's hand, cheers him up by pointing out that being half Denver Bronco is cool. The way Cartman processes this information tells us everything we need to know about his internal reality. He cannot integrate the moral weight of what he's done because he doesn't experience morality as a real force. He processes information through the filter of how it affects his self-image. Being half ginger is bad because it threatens his identity. Being a patricide who committed forced cannibalism generates no emotional response because those categories don't exist in his psychological framework. Right and wrong, as most people understand them, are simply not operative concepts in Cartman's mind. And that, more than any individual act of cruelty, is what makes him psychologically terrifying. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. The Scott Tenorman episode showed us Cartman's capabilities at their most extreme, but the show also spent 2 full seasons examining what happens when someone like Cartman enters a romantic relationship. And what that examination reveals about the mechanics of emotional abuse is genuinely unsettling. Across seasons 20 and 21 of South Park, the show did something it had never really attempted before. It gave Cartman a genuine romantic relationship, and then spent 2 full seasons documenting, with uncomfortable accuracy, exactly how someone with his psychological profile operates as a partner. The relationship between Cartman and Heidi Turner is not played entirely for laughs. It's one of the show's most sustained and serious examinations of emotional abuse, and it works because the writers understood, either intuitively or through research, how the cycle of abuse actually functions. It starts in season 20, during a period where Cartman appears to be genuinely changing. He begins dating Heidi Turner, a girl who is presented as kind, intelligent, and well-adjusted. Cartman seems to adopt a softer persona. He's kinder to the people around him. He says the right things. He appears to be making an effort to be a better person. And Heidi responds to this with genuine affection and investment. From the outside, it looks like growth. It looks like maybe, finally, the environment has shifted enough to allow Cartman to become something other than what he's always been. But season 21 pulls the curtain back, and what's behind it is textbook emotional abuse. Cartman begins controlling Heidi in ways that are subtle at first, and then increasingly brazen. He silences her when she disagrees with him. In one episode, he literally says the words, "Heidi, silence," cutting her off mid-sentence as if her thoughts are an interruption rather than a contribution. He secretly feeds her regular KFC while telling her it's vegan food, a deliberate deception that causes her to gain weight while he plays the supportive boyfriend who shares her dietary choices. He blames her for his own unhappiness, positioning himself as a victim of the relationship rather than its architect. And whenever Heidi tries to address the problems or assert herself, Cartman reframes the conversation so that she ends up apologizing to him. This pattern has a name in psychology. It's called DARVO, which stands for Deny, Attack, Reverse Victim, and Offender. It was identified by psychologist Jennifer Freed as a common response pattern among perpetrators of abuse when they are confronted with their behavior. The perpetrator first denies the behavior, then attacks the person confronting them, and then reverses the roles of victim and offender so that the perpetrator becomes the wrong party and the actual victim becomes the aggressor. Cartman does this instinctively and repeatedly throughout his relationship with Heidi. Kyle sees what's happening and tries to intervene. In one of the most psychologically astute moments in the entire series, Kyle tells Heidi directly that Cartman is never going to change because he always sees himself as the victim. Kyle explains that no matter what Cartman does, no matter how much harm he causes, he will always recast the situation so that he is the one being wronged. This is Cartman's core psychological defense mechanism. It's not denial in the simple sense of refusing to acknowledge reality. It's a complete restructuring of reality, so that his behavior is always justified, always defensive, always a response to some perceived injustice that may not exist anywhere outside his own mind. The show tracks Heidi's deterioration across the season with genuine care. She starts as a bright, confident girl and gradually becomes someone who is angry, confused, and increasingly resembles Cartman himself. She gains weight because of his deception. She becomes hostile toward people who try to help her, including Kyle. She starts defending Cartman's behavior and attacking anyone who criticizes him. She even begins adopting some of his cruelty and selfishness. This transformation mirrors what researchers have documented in real abusive relationships. Prolonged exposure to someone with narcissistic or antisocial traits can erode the victim's own identity, values, and personality. The victim begins to internalize the abuser's worldview. They start seeing themselves through the abuser's eyes, blaming themselves for the problems in the relationship. They become isolated from people who could help them because those people keep saying things the victim doesn't want to hear, and in some cases, they begin to adopt the abuser's behavior patterns as a survival mechanism or as a way of making sense of a reality that has been distorted beyond recognition. The Cartman and Heidi arc ends with Cartman framing their breakup as his own act of empowerment. He tells Heidi that he could not fix her, that he is worth something, and walks away with dramatic music playing as if he's the hero of his own movie. He goes outside, greets the boys, and resumes his life as if nothing happened. Meanwhile, Heidi is left to pick up the pieces of a personality that's been systematically dismantled over the course of a year. And the show doesn't flinch from showing the aftermath. In a later episode, Heidi is still affected. She tells a group of people that she is tired of always being mistreated and everyone ignores her. The show's point is brutal. The world doesn't particularly care about what Cartman did to Heidi. The systems around her didn't protect her while it was happening and aren't interested in her recovery now that it's over. This is the show at its most cynical and, unfortunately, its most realistic. What makes the Heidi arc so effective as a piece of psychological storytelling is that Cartman doesn't need to be physically violent to destroy someone. He doesn't hit Heidi. He doesn't lock her in a room. He manipulates her perception of reality so thoroughly that she loses track of who she was before the relationship started. That is emotional abuse operating at its purest, and the show depicts it with a level of accuracy that suggests the writers either consulted research or had direct experience with these dynamics. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. The Heidi arc shows how Cartman's psychology manifests in intimate relationships, but there's another dimension of his inner world that's even stranger. A dimension where the line between manipulation and genuine delusion becomes impossible to draw. One of the most fascinating and genuinely unsettling aspects of Cartman's psychology is his relationship to his own sense of reality. Throughout the series, Cartman displays behaviors that could be interpreted as either extraordinarily committed performance or as genuine dissociative episodes, and the show deliberately refuses to clarify which interpretation is correct. The most prominent example is Mitch Connor, which is Cartman's left hand with a face drawn on it. Mitch Connor first appears in Fat Butt and Pancake Head from Season 7, where Cartman uses the hand puppet to impersonate Jennifer Lopez. On the surface, this seems like one of Cartman's typical manipulations. He's using a puppet to deceive people. But the episode introduces something stranger. At certain points, Mitch Connor appears to operate independently of Cartman's conscious control. Cartman seems genuinely surprised by things Mitch says and does. He argues with the puppet, he appears frustrated by it, and the other characters can't determine whether Cartman is controlling the act or whether something else is going on. Mitch Connor returns in the two-part episodes 200 and 201 from Season 14, where the puppet plays a significant role in the plot. Once again, the show presents situations where Mitch Connor seems to know things Cartman doesn't know and to act in ways Cartman doesn't anticipate. The question of whether Mitch Connor is a deliberate act or a genuine alternate personality is never resolved, and I think that ambiguity is the point. The show is suggesting that for Cartman, the distinction between performing a lie and believing a lie may not be meaningful. His relationship to truth is so fundamentally distorted that the concepts of real and fake may not apply to his inner experience the way they apply to most people. The episode that explores this most explicitly is 1% from season 15. In this episode, Cartman's behavior escalates in a direction that looks genuinely pathological. He begins having elaborate conversations with his stuffed animals, each of which he has given a distinct personality and voice. There's Clyde Frog, Polly Prissy Pants, Muscleman Mark, Rumper Tumpskin, and Peter Panda. Cartman doesn't just play with these toys the way a normal child might. He treats them as independent beings with their own opinions, their own agendas, and their own emotional lives. He argues with them, he negotiates with them, he becomes angry at things they say, even though he is the one saying them. As the episode progresses, the stuffed animals are destroyed one by one in what appears to be a series of violent acts. Cartman blames mysterious forces, but the show strongly implies that Cartman himself is destroying his own toys while in some kind of dissociative state where he doesn't recognize himself as the one doing it. The South Park Wiki notes that this episode displays symptoms resembling dissociative identity disorder, with Cartman projecting aspects of his own personality onto his stuffed toys and then acting without his own knowledge and against his own will. Now here's the thing. Dissociative identity disorder, which used to be called multiple personality disorder, is a real and serious condition. It's typically associated with severe childhood trauma and involves the presence of two or more distinct personality states that alternately take control of the individual's behavior. I'm not suggesting that Cartman literally has DID because he's a fictional character, and the show plays this material for both comedy and horror simultaneously. But what the show is depicting through these episodes is a psyche that is so fractured, so detached from a coherent sense of self, that it can splinter into multiple, seemingly autonomous fragments. Whether Cartman is genuinely dissociating or simply performing a dissociation so committed that it becomes indistinguishable from the real thing is a question the show leaves deliberately unanswered. And I think that unanswered quality is itself psychologically accurate. In real clinical practice, distinguishing between malingering, which is faking symptoms for personal gain, and genuine dissociative disorders can be extraordinarily difficult. Some individuals are so skilled at deception that clinicians cannot reliably determine whether the presentation is authentic. And some individuals have distorted their own reality so thoroughly that they themselves may not know whether they believe what they're saying. This connects to a concept that psychologist Albert Bandura developed called moral disengagement. Moral disengagement describes the processes by which people selectively deactivate their moral self-regulation to permit conduct that would normally activate self-censure. Bandura identified several mechanisms of moral disengagement, including moral justification, where the harmful behavior is reframed as serving a moral purpose, diffusion of responsibility, where the individual distributes blame across a group, and dehumanization, where the victim is reframed as less than human and therefore undeserving of moral consideration. Cartman uses every single one of these mechanisms. He justifies his cruelty as defensive responses to perceived wrongs. He blames others for outcomes he engineered. He dehumanizes his victims by reducing them to categories, whether that's Jewish, ginger, poor, or simply less important than him. And his ability to project aspects of his personality onto external objects, whether stuffed animals or hand puppets, allows him to distance himself from his own actions in a way that seems to genuinely buffer him from self-awareness. The result is a character who appears to function without a coherent inner life in the way most people understand it. He doesn't have a stable identity that persists across situations. He has a collection of strategies, performances, and defensive mechanisms that shift depending on what the moment requires. When he needs to be charming, he's charming. When he needs to be pathetic, he's pathetic. When he needs to be terrifying, he's terrifying. And none of these modes seem to have any more claim to being the real Cartman than any other, because there may not be a real Cartman underneath them. There may just be the need for control, the fear of inadequacy, and the weapons he's built to protect himself from both. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Cartman's fractured sense of self connects to something broader about his character, which is his compulsive need to be in charge, to dominate every situation, and to occupy the center of every hierarchy he encounters. If there's one behavioral pattern that runs through every single thing Cartman does across the entire run of South Park, it's the need for control. He doesn't just want things, he wants to be the one who decides. He wants to be at the top of whatever hierarchy he finds himself in. And when that hierarchy doesn't exist, he creates one and puts himself at its head. You can see this in the way he constantly assigns himself leadership roles that nobody asked him to fill. His superhero alter ego, the Coon, is a perfect example. When the boys start playing superheroes, Cartman doesn't just create a character for himself, he creates a character who is explicitly the leader of the group, the one who gives orders and sets the agenda. When the other boys form their own superhero team and don't include Cartman, his response is not disappointment or hurt feelings. His response is to ally with Cthulhu, a literal interdimensional cosmic horror, and use it as a weapon to destroy his former friends and force them to accept his authority. Think about that for a second. His friends didn't want him in their group, and his response was to summon a being of apocalyptic power to burn everything down. That is not a proportional response. That is a narcissistic injury being addressed with overwhelming force, because for Cartman, not being in charge is not an inconvenience. It's an existential threat. His identity cannot survive being subordinate. He would rather destroy the entire game than play it as an equal participant. This pattern repeats in virtually every context Cartman enters. When he hears about the Crack Baby Athletic Association in Season 15, he doesn't just join or observe. He immediately takes over, turning the exploitation of crack-addicted babies into a structured business that he runs from the top. When he sees the Special Olympics as an opportunity, he doesn't compete alongside the athletes. He fakes a disability so he can compete against them and win, because the point isn't participation. The point is dominance. The point is being above everyone else, even if that means cheating a group of disabled children out of a prize they train for. In the Passion of the Jew episode from Season 8, after watching The Passion of the Christ, Cartman doesn't just enjoy the movie or internalize its message. He organizes a movement. He gathers followers, he leads them through the streets. He positions himself as the figure at the front of the march, the one who sets the direction and speaks for the group. It doesn't matter that his interpretation of the film is twisted beyond recognition or that his followers barely understand what they're supporting. What matters is that he's leading them, that they're following, and that Kyle is watching from the outside looking horrified. The psychological research on narcissism describes this need for control as stemming from deep underlying insecurity. The Zimbardo.com analysis of Cartman put it this way: despite his outward confidence, Cartman harbors underlying insecurities, particularly related to social status and acceptance, and his aggressive and often offensive behavior can be viewed as defensive mechanisms to mask feelings of inadequacy or vulnerability. This is an important insight because it reframes Cartman's grandiosity not as genuine self-assurance, but as a constantly maintained performance designed to prevent anyone, including himself, from seeing how fragile and frightened the real person underneath might be. Every authoritarian figure, whether in fiction or in reality, shares this fundamental characteristic. The need for control is never about strength. It's always about fear. The person who must control everything is the person who cannot tolerate uncertainty, cannot tolerate disagreement, cannot tolerate the possibility that someone else might be right, or might be more capable, or might be more valued. Cartman cannot tolerate any of these things, and so he spends his entire existence constructing and maintaining hierarchies in which he sits at the top, destroying any structure that doesn't place him there, and punishing anyone who challenges his position. This dynamic appears throughout the series whenever anyone questions Cartman's intelligence or ideas. When the boys challenge one of his schemes, Cartman doesn't just argue his case. He goes to elaborate and cruel lengths to prove that he was right all along. The need to be correct, to be validated, to be acknowledged as the smartest person in the room, drives him to invest enormous resources into what amounts to an extended exercise in punishing someone for the crime of disagreeing with him. And this connects to a real psychological phenomenon. Research on narcissistic personality traits has found that individuals high in narcissism respond to ego threats with disproportionate hostility and aggression. The threat doesn't have to be large. It doesn't have to be intentional. It just has to be perceived as a challenge to the narcissist's self-image. A minor disagreement can trigger a major response because for the narcissistic individual, every challenge to their authority or intelligence or superiority is experienced as an attack on their core identity. And when your identity is built on being the best, the smartest, the most important, then anyone who suggests otherwise, even indirectly, becomes an enemy who must be defeated. Cartman's need for control extends beyond his peer group into his family dynamics. His relationship with Leanne, as we discussed, is essentially a reversal of the normal parent-child power structure. Cartman controls his mother. He dictates what they eat, what they do, how the household operates. When she attempts to assert parental authority, as in the Cesar Millan episode, he responds with rage, property destruction, and even contemplates matricide. He threatens to call Child Protective Services when discipline is imposed on him, which is itself a sophisticated act of using institutional power to maintain personal control. He understands that the threat of involving an authority can be used to neutralize another authority, and he deploys that understanding without hesitation. This is the behavior of someone who experiences any reduction in their personal autonomy as a form of violence against them. For Cartman, being told no isn't a boundary, it's an attack. Being disciplined isn't a consequence, it's oppression. Being questioned isn't dialogue, it's disrespect. And the only acceptable state of affairs is one in which his will is unchallenged and his position is supreme. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. All of this paints a picture of someone who is entirely and irredeemably monstrous, but the show is more sophisticated than that. There are moments, rare and fleeting, where Cartman shows something that looks like genuine human emotion. And those moments are actually more disturbing than his cruelty, because they suggest that somewhere under all the manipulation and the narcissism and the psychopathic detachment, there might be a person who could have been different. The question of whether Cartman has any genuine humanity is one of the most contested topics among people who watch South Park closely. Some fans argue that his rare emotional moments are themselves manipulations, performances designed to gain sympathy or lower people's defenses. Others argue that the show depicts a character who genuinely does have the capacity for connection and empathy, but who has buried those capacities so deep beneath layers of defense mechanisms and pathological behavior patterns that they can only surface in moments of extreme vulnerability. I think the show supports the second interpretation, and I think that interpretation is more psychologically interesting and more consistent with what we know about real people with antisocial and narcissistic traits. Most clinical literature on ASPD and narcissistic personality disorder notes that these individuals are not completely devoid of emotional capacity. They have emotions, they can form attachments, they can feel pain. What they lack is the ability or willingness to allow those emotions to guide their behavior in prosocial ways. The emotions exist but are suppressed, redirected, or weaponized rather than being experienced and expressed in healthy ways. The Cartman and Heidi relationship, in its earliest phase during season 20, offers one of the clearest windows into this buried emotional capacity. When Cartman first starts dating Heidi, there are moments that appear genuinely tender. He seems to care about her. He seems to enjoy her company for reasons beyond what she can do for him. He seems, for a brief period, to be experiencing something like normal human connection. The question is whether this was real connection that he was subsequently incapable of sustaining, or whether it was always a performance that merely resembled connection from the outside. I think it was real, and I think the show supports this. The tragedy of the Heidi arc is not that Cartman tricked her from the beginning, it's that he started with something genuine, and then, because of who he is, and because of what his psychology demands, destroyed it through the very mechanisms we've been discussing throughout this video. The narcissism demanded that the relationship revolve around him. The Machiavellianism led him to manipulate her to maintain control. The psychopathic detachment allowed him to watch her deterioration without feeling responsible for it. Whatever spark of real connection existed at the beginning was systematically extinguished by the same traits that define his character. The Cesar Millan episode from season 10 offers another glimpse of Cartman's buried humanity, and it might be the most powerful one in the entire series. When Caesar's techniques work and Cartman begins to change, there's a scene where he appears to physically battle his own darker nature. He vomits what looks like black fluid, fights against something invisible, and collapses. The next morning, he's doing homework and eating breakfast. He's polite, he's functional. He's, for the first time in the series, behaving like a normal 10-year-old boy. This scene suggests that the healthy version of Cartman exists. It's in there somewhere, buried under years of pathological development and environmental reinforcement. The child who does homework and eats healthy food and speaks politely to his mother is not a stranger inhabiting Cartman's body. It's a version of Cartman that was never given the chance to develop because the environment that shaped him rewarded the pathological version and punished or ignored the healthy one. And that is why Leon's immediate reversion at the end of the episode is so devastating. When she offers to buy him whatever he wants, when she treats him as a companion instead of a child, she isn't just spoiling him. She's murdering the healthy version of her son. She is extinguishing the part of him that could have been different because maintaining that part requires consistent effort, consistent boundaries, and consistent authority that she is psychologically incapable of providing. The sinister look on Cartman's face at the end of the episode is not the look of a monster triumphing. It's the look of a child whose only viable self is the pathological one, because the world around him has made that self the only one that works. There's also the matter of Cartman's attachment to objects he can control. His cat, Mr. Kitty, his stuffed animals before he destroyed them. These are beings and objects that he can relate to without the risk of being challenged, rejected, or found inadequate. He can love his cat because his cat will never tell him he's wrong. He can confide in his stuffed animals because they'll never repeat what he says. His capacity for attachment appears strongest in contexts where the attachment object has no independent agency. The moment another person asserts their own will, their own perspective, their own needs, Cartman's capacity for connection collapses and the defensive machinery takes over. This pattern is consistent with what psychologists call avoidant attachment, a relational style characterized by discomfort with emotional closeness and a preference for maintaining distance in relationships. Individuals with avoidant attachment often had caregivers who were emotionally unavailable or inconsistent, which teaches the child that depending on others leads to disappointment. Leon, for all her indulgence, is emotionally inconsistent. She's warm and permissive in ways that feel good in the moment but don't provide genuine emotional security. She doesn't see Cartman clearly. She doesn't reflect back to him an accurate picture of who he is. She reflects back whatever version of him keeps the peace and maintains her own comfort. And a child who is never accurately seen by their primary caregiver learns not to show their real self to anyone because the real self was apparently never what the caregiver wanted. The rare moments of humanity in Cartman are not redemptive. They don't suggest he's secretly a good person underneath the cruelty. What they suggest is something sadder and more complicated, which is that the capacity for goodness existed at some point but was never cultivated, was actively suppressed by environmental factors, and now survives only as occasional flickers in moments of extreme vulnerability that are immediately extinguished by the return of the defensive patterns that keep him functioning. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Cartman's buried humanity, or what remains of it, tells us that this character is more than just a collection of pathological traits. He is a complete psychological portrait, and to fully understand that portrait, we need to examine a few more of the relationships and situations that reveal how his psychology operates in practice. But before we get to that larger societal question, there are a few more relationships and episodes that deserve examination, because they add crucial evidence to the psychological profile we've been building. We've looked at Cartman's relationship with Kyle as his adversary and with Heidi as his romantic victim. But there's a third type of relationship Cartman cultivates, one that reveals something different about how he operates, and that's his dynamic with Butters Stotch. Because if Kyle is Cartman's primary adversary and the person against whom he defines himself through conflict, Butters is something different and in many ways more disturbing. Butters is the person Cartman exploits most consistently and most casually, and the reason that exploitation works tells us something important about how people with antisocial traits select and maintain their victims. Butters is, by design, the most vulnerable child in South Park. He's naive, trusting, eager to please, and terrified of getting in trouble with his parents, who are themselves depicted as emotionally neglectful and excessively punitive. Butters represents the kind of person who predators of all types gravitate toward. Someone whose need for acceptance and fear of conflict makes them incapable of saying no effectively. And Cartman recognizes this about Butters instantly and exploits it with surgical precision. Throughout the series, Cartman uses Butters as a fall guy, a scapegoat, a personal servant, and a tool for carrying out plans that Cartman himself doesn't want to be directly associated with. In one episode, Cartman convinces Butters that the world has ended and keeps him trapped in a bunker for days. In another, Cartman's schemes result in Butters being committed to a mental institution where he is subjected to prolonged medical procedures. In yet another, Cartman manipulates Butters into dangerous situations simply to amuse himself, with no concern for the physical or psychological consequences. What makes the Cartman and Butters dynamic particularly useful for understanding real-world predatory behavior is the mechanism of selection. Cartman doesn't use Butters because Butters is available. He uses Butters because Butters is optimal. Butters won't fight back effectively. Butters will believe implausible cover stories. Butters will forgive and forget and come back for more. Butters' parents will blame Butters rather than investigating the actual cause of whatever situation he ends up in. Every element of Butters' personality and family situation makes him the ideal target for someone with Cartman's profile. Research on victimization patterns in relationships involving individuals with dark triad traits has found exactly this kind of selectivity. Individuals high in Machiavellianism and psychopathy don't target people randomly. They assess potential targets for exploitability, looking for traits like agreeableness, conflict avoidance, low self-esteem, and insufficient social support. They then test those targets with small boundary violations to gauge how much they can get away with. If the target accepts small violations without resistance, the violations escalate. The process is gradual enough that the target often doesn't recognize what's happening until they're deeply enmeshed. Cartman does this with Butters throughout the series. He starts with small requests and minor manipulations. When Butters complies without resistance, the demands escalate. When Butters suffers consequences from Cartman's schemes and still comes back, Cartman learns that the exploitation can continue indefinitely. And because Butters' parents respond to his suffering by punishing him rather than investigating, the external check that might otherwise protect Butters doesn't function. Butters is trapped in a system where every authority that should help him instead makes things worse, and the person exploiting him faces no consequences. This is depressingly realistic. In workplaces, in families, and social groups, the person being exploited by a manipulative individual often has nowhere to turn, because the systems that should protect them are either absent, incompetent, or actively contributing to the problem. The HR department that sides with the charming manager over the struggling employee, the family that excuses the abusive relative because addressing the problem would disrupt the family dynamic, the friend group that tells the victim they're being too sensitive because acknowledging the problem would require them to act. The Kuhn trilogy from seasons 13 and 14 deserves more detailed examination as well because it's one of the longest and most elaborate demonstrations of what happens when Cartman's need for control collides with a structure that won't accommodate it. The setup is that the boys create superhero alter egos and form a group called Kuhn and Friends. Cartman naturally positions himself as the Kuhn, the leader and most important member. But the other boys don't accept his leadership. They form their own team dynamics, make their own decisions, and generally operate as a collaborative group rather than a hierarchy with Cartman at its head. Kenny, as his alter ego Mysterion, emerges as the de facto leader because of his genuine sense of responsibility and sacrifice. Cartman's response to being sidelined within the group he named after himself follows a predictable escalation. First, he tries to reassert control through bluster and demands. When that fails, he tries to manipulate the group from within. When that fails too, he leaves the group entirely and allies himself with Cthulhu, an entity of incomprehensible power that responds to Cartman's manipulations. Because in one of the show's most absurd and psychologically astute jokes, even a cosmic horror is susceptible to the emotional manipulation tactics of a narcissistic 10-year-old. With Cthulhu at his command, Cartman attacks his former friends. He uses a being capable of destroying reality to settle what amounts to a schoolyard disagreement about who gets to be in charge. The disproportion between the provocation and the response is the point. Cartman does not calibrate his responses to the actual severity of the offense. He calibrates them to the severity of the narcissistic injury, and any challenge to his authority registers as a maximum severity wound regardless of how minor the actual challenge was. The trilogy also explores Cartman's relationship with heroism and goodness. He calls himself a superhero. He genuinely believes he's making the world a better place. But when Kenny, as Mysterian, points out that Cartman's actions are helping only himself, Cartman's response is revealing. He says that helping himself is what superheroes do. He cannot conceive of heroism as self-sacrifice or service to others. In his psychology, heroism is power exercised for personal benefit, and anyone who defines it differently is either lying or naive. This distortion of moral concepts is something psychologists have documented in individuals with narcissistic personality features. The narcissistic individual doesn't reject moral categories entirely, they redefine them. Kindness becomes a tool for creating obligation. Loyalty becomes a demand for unquestioning obedience. Friendship becomes a transaction where the narcissist provides presence and the friend provides service. And heroism becomes the exercise of power in one's own interest, rebranded as something noble through the magic of self-congratulating narrative. The Make Love Not Warcraft episode from Season 10, while primarily a comedy episode about gaming addiction, contains a detail that illuminates another facet of Cartman's psychology. When the boys decide to level up their World of Warcraft characters by grinding for weeks, Cartman is the one who commits most fully to the effort. He gains weight, he stops bathing, he uses a bedpan, he demands his mother bring him food and bathroom supplies while he plays, and he does all of this without hesitation because the stakes, defeating another player in a video game, are sufficient to justify any level of personal degradation and any level of burden on the people around him. This is Cartman's relationship to effort in a nutshell. He's not lazy in the conventional sense. He's capable of extraordinary commitment and sustained effort. But he only deploys that effort in service of goals that the rest of the world would recognize as trivial, selfish, or destructive. He'll work harder than anyone to win a game. He'll plan for weeks to execute a revenge scheme. He'll go to absurd lengths to prove someone wrong about a minor point. But he won't do homework. He won't maintain a relationship. He won't invest effort in anything that benefits someone other than himself. This selective deployment of effort is a hallmark of individuals with antisocial and narcissistic traits. They're not generally incapable. They're specifically unmotivated by the things that motivate most people, like social responsibility, genuine connection, and contributing to the well-being of others. Their energy is real, their commitment is real, their intelligence is real, but all of it flows exclusively towards self-serving goals, which means that from society's perspective, all that capability is effectively wasted. It doesn't add value, it extracts it. I also want to circle back briefly to the Cartmanland episode from Season 5 because there's a dimension of it I didn't fully explore earlier that connects to the broader theme of what Cartman reveals about how we understand justice and fairness. When Cartman inherits the $1 million and buys the amusement park, Kyle's hemorrhoid is described by the show as stress-induced. Kyle's physical health deteriorates specifically because he cannot psychologically reconcile the fact that a terrible person has received an enormous reward while he, Kyle, who tries to be a good person, receives nothing comparable. Kyle interprets this as evidence that the universe is unjust, that God either doesn't exist or doesn't care, and that being good is pointless if being bad produces better outcomes. This is not just a comedy plot. This is a genuine philosophical and psychological crisis that many people experience. Psychologists call it the just world hypothesis, which is the belief that people generally get what they deserve, that good behavior leads to good outcomes, and bad behavior leads to bad outcomes. When reality violates this belief, as it frequently does, people experience genuine psychological distress. They feel anxious, depressed, and sometimes angry, because the framework they use to make sense of the world has been undermined. Cartman, without intending to, is a constant violation of the just world hypothesis for everyone around him. He behaves terribly and frequently succeeds. He causes harm and frequently avoids consequences. He treats people badly and still has friends, still has a place in the community, still lives a life that is no worse and sometimes better than the lives of people who treat others with decency and respect. For anyone who believes in cosmic justice or moral balance, Cartman's continued success is an ongoing source of existential frustration. The show uses this to make a point that is uncomfortable but important. The just world hypothesis is a cognitive bias, not a description of reality. Bad people sometimes prosper, good people sometimes suffer. And the expectation that the universe will reward virtue and punish vice is a source of psychological vulnerability because it sets people up to be devastated by outcomes that are, from the universe's perspective, entirely random. Cartman doesn't care about any of this. He doesn't think about justice or fairness or cosmic balance. He pursues what he wants with the tools available to him and lets the consequences land where they land. And there's an ironic freedom in that, a freedom that the show is honest enough to depict even as it shows the destruction that freedom produces. Cartman is free from the psychological burden of expecting the world to be fair because he never expected it to be fair in the first place. He's free from the disappointment that comes when good behavior goes unrewarded because he never invested in good behavior. He's free from the existential crisis that Kyle experiences because the questions that torment Kyle simply don't register as meaningful to Cartman. This doesn't make Cartman right, it makes him unburdened, and the show is smart enough to recognize that being unburdened and being healthy are not the same thing. Cartman's freedom from moral anxiety is purchased at the cost of everything that makes a human life genuinely meaningful. He's free from doubt, but also from depth. He's free from guilt, but also from growth. He's free from the expectations of others, but also from the richness that comes from genuine reciprocal relationships. The show's portrait of Cartman is ultimately a portrait of a kind of emptiness that masquerades as power. He appears strong because he doesn't care. He appears free because he has no commitments. He appears superior because he never questions himself. But these appearances are all inversions of the reality, which is that his indifference is a defense against pain he can't process. His lack of commitment is an inability to sustain connection, and his self-certainty is an inability to grow. And the fact that he's been exactly this way for over 25 years of television, that he has resisted change with a consistency that no other character in the show matches, is itself the final data point in his psychological profile. Cartman is not evolving, he is calcifying. And the longer the pattern holds, the more rigid it becomes, and the less likely any intervention would be to break through. There's another dimension of Cartman's psychology that deserves attention, and that's his relationship to ideology and belief systems. Because Cartman doesn't have beliefs in the way that most people have beliefs. He has tools, and ideologies, religions, social movements, and cultural identities are some of the most powerful tools available to him. Throughout the series, Cartman has adopted and discarded belief systems with the kind of casual ease that most people reserve for changing clothes. He's been a devout follower of Mel Gibson's interpretation of Christianity when it allowed him to organize anti-Jewish rallies. He's been the leader of a ginger separatist movement when being ginger served his interests. He's been a motivational speaker, a youth pastor figure, a business guru, and a political organizer, each time adopting the language and trappings of the role with enough conviction to attract followers and enough cynicism to discard it when it stops being useful. This pattern is consistent with what psychologists call instrumental belief adoption, where an individual doesn't internalize a belief system because they find it true or meaningful, but adopts it because it serves a practical function. The belief is a vehicle, not a destination. And Cartman is a master of driving whatever vehicle gets him where he wants to go. The ginger separatist movement from the season 9 episode Ginger Kids is a perfect example. Cartman begins the episode by giving a class presentation arguing that ginger kids, children with red hair and freckles, are disgusting subhumans. The other kids are appalled, and Stan and Kyle decide to teach Cartman a lesson by making him up to look like a ginger while he sleeps. When Cartman wakes up believing he's become a ginger, he doesn't abandon his position on ginger inferiority. He immediately reverses it. He becomes the most passionate advocate for ginger rights in the school. He organizes the ginger kids into a movement, gives speeches, and ultimately leads them to a point of dangerous extremism. The speed of the reversal is the point. Cartman didn't change his mind because he learned empathy or because he came to understand the ginger kids' perspective. He changed his position because his circumstances changed. When being anti-ginger served his ego, he was anti-ginger. When being pro-ginger served his ego, he was pro-ginger. The content of the belief was irrelevant. What mattered was which belief put him at the center of attention and at the top of a hierarchy. This is how individuals with narcissistic and Machiavellian traits often interact with belief systems in the real world. They don't attach to the beliefs themselves, they attach to the social power the beliefs provide. They can switch allegiances, adopt new identities, and champion contradictory positions without experiencing the cognitive dissonance that would trouble someone who actually believed what they were saying. Because they don't believe what they're saying, they're performing belief, and the performance is always in service of a strategic goal. The Up the Down steroid episode from Season 8 deserves a closer look as well because it demonstrates another facet of Cartman's exploitative psychology. His scheme to fake being disabled and compete in the Special Olympics for the $1,000 prize is not just morally repugnant, it's structurally revealing. Consider what the scheme requires. Cartman has to study disability well enough to convincingly fake it. He reads books, he observes disabled children on the bus, he practices physical mannerisms, he modifies his appearance, he creates an entirely false persona to pass himself off as something he isn't. And he does all of this not because he needs the money in any desperate sense, but because the idea of getting money by outsmarting a system designed to help vulnerable people appeals to him on a fundamental level. This is exploitation for its own sake. The $1,000 is almost beside the point. What drives Cartman is the satisfaction of having deceived a system, of having taken something meant for people who genuinely need it, and of having proven to himself that he's clever enough to get away with it. The actual disabled children he's competing against, children who trained hard and who the Special Olympics was created to support, register to him as obstacles in his scheme, not as people with their own experiences and dignity. And here's the detail that makes the episode a genuine piece of psychological satire rather than just a tasteless comedy bit. Cartman loses. He fakes being disabled and enters the Special Olympics, and he comes in last. The actual disabled athletes are better than him because they've been training genuinely while he's been training to fake a condition. His superiority complex, his certainty that he's better than everyone, runs headfirst into reality, and reality wins. The show doesn't let Cartman learn from this. He doesn't come away thinking that maybe disabled people are more capable than he assumed, or that maybe exploiting vulnerable populations is wrong. He comes away frustrated that his scheme didn't work. The moral lesson is available. It's sitting right there. And Cartman walks past it without noticing because his psychology has no mechanism for converting experience into moral growth. He can learn practical lessons like not to bet against trained athletes even if they have disabilities. But he cannot learn ethical lessons because the part of his mind where ethical processing would happen appears to be either absent or permanently offline. This is what the clinical literature means when it describes individuals with antisocial personality features as having a persistent failure to learn from experience when it comes to the consequences of their behavior. The learning deficit is not general. These individuals can learn plenty when the subject is practical, strategic, or self-serving. The deficit is specific to moral and social learning, the kind of learning that requires empathy, self-reflection, and the ability to see your own behavior from someone else's perspective. Cartman manipulates his own mother to sign him up for the Special Olympics by giving her a tearful speech about wanting to understand what disabled children go through. Leon, who should know her son well enough to see through this obvious manipulation, is moved by his words and agrees. This is another small but significant demonstration of how Leanne's parenting enables Cartman's worst behavior. She wants to believe her son is capable of compassion, and that desire makes her vulnerable to a performance of compassion that a more skeptical parent would see through immediately. Every element of the scheme, from the research to the disguise to the emotional manipulation of his mother, to the attempted exploitation of disabled children, follows the same logic that governs all of Cartman's behavior. Identify a vulnerability, construct a plan to exploit it, execute the plan without concern for the people it harms. And when it fails, feel frustrated about the failure rather than guilty about the attempt. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. All of this additional evidence reinforces what we've been building toward throughout this video, which is a comprehensive understanding of how Cartman's psychology works and what it reveals about the society that produces and enables people like him. Eric Cartman is funny. I want to acknowledge that before we go any further because I think it matters. He's one of the funniest characters in the history of television, and a lot of his appeal comes from the fact that he says and does things that are so outrageously wrong, so completely beyond the pale, that the only reasonable response is to laugh. But the laughter is doing something. It's creating a safe distance between us and the recognition that Cartman's behavior, stripped of its cartoon context, maps onto real patterns of real harm committed by real people. And that's not an accident. That's the point. Trey Parker and Matt Stone have said in various interviews over the years that South Park works by taking real social dynamics and exaggerating them until the underlying absurdity becomes impossible to ignore. Cartman is the show's most effective vehicle for this because his behavior is simultaneously too extreme to take literally and too accurate to dismiss entirely. He's a funhouse mirror. He distorts the image, but the distortion reveals things the undistorted image hides. The Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung developed the concept of the shadow archetype, which represents the darker, unconscious aspects of the human psyche. The shadow contains the impulses, desires, and tendencies that a person or a society represses because they conflict with the conscious self-image. According to Jung, the shadow doesn't disappear just because it's repressed. It manifests in other ways, through projection onto other people, through sudden eruptions of behavior that seem out of character, or through cultural figures that embody the suppressed qualities and allow the audience to engage with them vicariously. The Zimbardo.com psychological analysis of Cartman explicitly invoked this framework, describing him as embodying the shadow archetype and noting that his behavior reveals suppressed impulses such as aggression, greed, and prejudice, which he often projects onto others or acts out overtly. Cartman is not just a character. He's a psychological mechanism. He allows the audience to engage with their own suppressed impulses in a safe container, to laugh at the darkness they recognize in themselves without having to acknowledge it directly. But the show goes further than just using Cartman as a personal mirror. It uses him as a social one. And this is where things get genuinely uncomfortable, because the show consistently demonstrates that Cartman doesn't succeed in spite of the society around him. He succeeds because of it. The systems that are supposed to contain, correct, or punish antisocial behavior not only fail to do so, they actively enable it. Look at the adults in South Park. They are, almost without exception, incompetent. Mr. Mackey, the school counselor, cannot manage Cartman's behavior or even accurately diagnose what's wrong. Principal Victoria berates Cartman but takes no effective action. The police are useless. The therapists are outmaneuvered. Even Caesar Millen, who actually succeeds temporarily, can't stay long enough to make the change permanent because he has other clients. The entire infrastructure of adult authority that is supposed to protect children from developing the way Cartman has developed is depicted as fundamentally broken. And this isn't just a joke. This mirrors real-world failures in addressing childhood conduct disorder. The NCBI Stat Pearls entry on antisocial personality disorder notes that the condition is infrequently diagnosed and that people with ASPD are rarely referred for treatment. The entry goes on to say that despite numerous interventions tested in the past, no standard treatment algorithm exists. The system that is supposed to catch children like Cartman and redirect them toward healthier development doesn't work particularly well in real life either. The show's depiction of a society that shrugs at Cartman's escalating behavior is satire, but it's satire grounded in a real and documented failure of institutions. Then there's the matter of enablement. Cartman doesn't just avoid consequences. He's actively rewarded. When he organizes the Crack Baby Athletic Association in season 15, exploiting babies who are addicted to crack by turning their suffering into entertainment. The scheme works. He finds partners, generates interest, and runs the operation as a functional business. When he organizes followers after watching The Passion of the Christ, adults in the town follow him. When he runs for school office or takes over projects, people go along with it because his energy and commitment and willingness to do things other people won't do gives him a kind of social momentum that others either admire or are too apathetic to resist. This is how antisocial behavior is reinforced at a societal level. The individual does something harmful, and the society's response is not punishment or correction, but accommodation. People make excuses. They look the other way. They tell themselves it's not that bad, or that someone else will deal with it, or that confronting the behavior directly would be more trouble than it's worth. And every time the harmful behavior goes unchallenged, it gets stronger. It becomes more normalized. The individual learns that they can do more, push further, and take more without facing meaningful resistance. The psychologist Albert Bandura identified this dynamic in his research on moral disengagement. Bandura found that individuals don't typically make a conscious decision to abandon their moral principles. Instead, they gradually deactivate their moral self-regulation through a series of small steps, each of which seems individually harmless, but collectively produces a capacity for behavior that the individual would have found unthinkable at the beginning of the process. And crucially, this process doesn't just happen inside the individual, it happens within groups and societies as well. When a group repeatedly tolerates behavior that violates its stated norms, the group's collective moral regulation weakens over time. The threshold for what's considered acceptable shifts, and behaviors that would once have provoked outrage become ordinary. Cartman is the show's test case for this phenomenon. The other characters in South Park have been watching Cartman escalate his behavior for over 25 years. And while they occasionally express shock or disgust, they always return to the status quo. Stan and Kyle go back to hanging out with Cartman. The school keeps enrolling him. The parents keep letting their kids interact with him. Nobody takes the sustained, consistent action that would be necessary to actually change the dynamic. And the result is that Cartman keeps getting worse, because the environment keeps teaching him that worse is acceptable. The show also uses Cartman to explore how prejudice and bigotry function as social tools. Cartman's racism, anti-Semitism, and general hatred of various groups is not presented as a deep ideological commitment. It's presented as opportunistic. He uses prejudice when it serves him and abandons it when it doesn't. He organizes against Jewish people one week and befriends someone from a group he's attacked the next, if that friendship serves his immediate interests. His bigotry is strategic, not principled. And this is actually more realistic and more disturbing than if it were sincere. Research on prejudice has long recognized that bigotry often functions less as a genuine belief system and more as a social tool for establishing dominance, creating in groups and outgroups, and mobilizing people around a shared enemy. Cartman understands this intuitively. He weaponizes identity categories not because he genuinely cares about racial or religious distinctions, but because he understands that those categories can be used to organize people, direct anger, and consolidate his own power. The episode World War Zimmerman from season 17 illustrates this with particular clarity. Cartman becomes obsessed with the idea that Tolkien Black, one of his classmates, is going to take revenge on him for the George Zimmerman verdict. Nobody has suggested this. Tolkien has shown no signs of anger toward Cartman. But Cartman projects his own assumptions about racial dynamics onto Tolkien and then takes a series of increasingly extreme actions based on those projections. He's not responding to a real threat. He's creating a narrative in which he's the threatened party, and then responding to the narrative he created as if it were reality. This is projection operating at full force, and it mirrors how prejudice functions in the real world. The prejudiced individual projects their own fears and assumptions onto a group, treats those projections as facts, and then uses those manufactured facts as justification for hostility. Cartman does this openly and absurdly, but the mechanism is the same one that operates in subtler forms throughout real human social behavior. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Understanding what Cartman reflects about society raises a natural follow-up question, which is whether someone like Cartman can ever actually change, and what the show's answer to that question tells us about the nature of personality and the possibility of psychological transformation. One of the deepest questions the show asks through Cartman's character is whether psychological change is actually possible for someone whose pathology is this entrenched. And the show's answer, explored across multiple episodes and spanning the entire run of the series, is complicated enough to be genuinely interesting. It's not simply no. It's something more like yes, but only under conditions that are virtually impossible to sustain, which effectively makes the answer no for practical purposes. We've already discussed the Cesar Millan episode from season 10 in detail, so I'll summarize the relevant point briefly. When Cesar Millan applies consistent boundaries and calm authority to Cartman, Cartman changes. He becomes a functional, healthy child. The change is depicted as real, not as a performance or a manipulation. Cartman genuinely begins behaving differently because the environmental conditions that maintained his pathology were temporarily altered. But when the environmental change is reversed, when Leanne goes back to being permissive and indulgent, Cartman reverts instantly. The episode's thesis is clear. Individual change cannot survive in an unchanged environment. This is consistent with what clinical psychology knows about the treatment of personality disorders in general and antisocial personality disorder in particular. The NCBI Stat Pearls entry on ASPD describes it as typically a lifelong condition refractory to treatment interventions. It notes that while some patients show improvement with age, the mean age of remission is 35, and many patients remain symptomatic throughout their lives. The entry also notes that those with less baseline symptomatology show better remission rates, which implies that the more severe the initial presentation, the less likely improvement becomes. Cartman's initial presentation, if we're treating him as a clinical case, is extremely severe. He meets every criterion for conduct disorder at the childhood onset level, which is the type associated with worse long-term outcomes. He displays all three dark triad traits at high levels. He has multiple potential dissociative features. He has no consistent external support for change, no effective therapeutic relationship, and no environmental modifications that persist beyond individual episodes. By every clinical measure, Cartman is the kind of patient who would fall into the group that never improves, rather than the group that eventually remits. There's an episode from Season 6 called My Future Self and Me that explores the possibility of change from a different angle, and it's one of the most thematically precise episodes in the entire series. In this episode, a handsome, successful man appears at the Cartman household and claims to be Cartman's future self. He tells Cartman that this moment, right now, is the turning point in his life. From this day forward, everything gets better. He turns his life around, takes care of himself, and eventually becomes the CEO of a successful time-traveling company. But Cartman doesn't believe him. After spending the episode watching Stan deal with a scam organization called Motivation Corp that hires actors to pretend to be kids' future selves as a cautionary tale about drug use, Cartman is convinced that this man is another actor, another trick, another manipulation designed to control his behavior. So he dismisses the man entirely and vows to redouble his worst habits out of spite. The twist is that the man really was Cartman's future self. He was telling the truth. This really was the turning point, and because Cartman refused to believe it, refused to accept the possibility that change was real and available to him, his future self transforms on the spot into an obese, unemployed mechanic. The future self looks down at himself and mutters a defeated response. This is the show's most devastating commentary on the relationship between cynicism and self-destruction. Cartman's pathology has made him so distrustful, so certain that every interaction is a manipulation, that he cannot recognize genuine opportunity when it presents itself. His defenses, which were built to protect him from a chaotic and unreliable world, have become the very thing that prevents him from escaping that world. He can't trust the good because his entire life has taught him that the good is either fake or temporary. And so he rejects it, and in rejecting it, he ensures that his worst predictions about himself come true. This is a psychological trap that has been documented in real clinical literature on personality disorders. Individuals with deeply entrenched defensive patterns often sabotage opportunities for improvement because the improvement requires vulnerability, and vulnerability is the thing their defenses were specifically designed to prevent. The patient who has learned that trusting people leads to pain will not trust the therapist who is trying to help them. The person who has learned that lowering their guard leads to exploitation will not lower their guard for the partner who genuinely cares about them. The defense mechanism that was adaptive in the original harmful environment becomes maladaptive in environments that are actually safe. But the individual cannot distinguish between the two because the defense activates automatically regardless of context. Cartman cannot tell the difference between genuine help and a manipulation designed to control him, because from his perspective there is no difference. Every interaction in his life, from his permissive mother who enables him to the peers who tolerate him to the institutions that fail him, has taught him that other people's actions are always self-serving. The idea that someone might be offering him something genuinely good for its own sake is incomprehensible to him. Not because he lacks the intelligence to understand it, but because his entire life experience has provided no evidence for it. The post-COVID Paramount Plus specials offer another window into the question of change, and they do so by presenting us with the most extreme possible version of a reformed Cartman, and then asking us whether we believe it. In the future timeline depicted in these specials, Cartman has become a rabbi. He has a wife and children. He's part of a religious community. He appears to have found meaning, purpose, and genuine connection through faith and family. He's kind to people. He's patient with his children. He speaks with a warmth and sincerity that is completely absent from everything we've seen of him across decades of episodes. He is, by every outward measure, a completely different person. And the show puts Kyle in the position that any of us would be in if someone we knew to be manipulative, cruel, and deceptive suddenly appeared to be genuinely transformed. Kyle cannot accept it. He watches Cartman being kind and suspects manipulation. He sees Cartman with his family and assumes it's a long con. He looks at the evidence of transformation and filters it through decades of experience that tell him Cartman cannot be trusted. And Kyle's suspicion is completely reasonable because everything he knows about Cartman supports it. But here's what makes this storyline so psychologically rich. Kyle's reasonable suspicion may itself be preventing him from seeing something true. His justified distrust may be blinding him to genuine change. And there is no way for either Kyle or the audience to know for certain which interpretation is correct, because the evidence is genuinely ambiguous. The show constructed the ambiguity deliberately because it mirrors the real-world situation perfectly. When someone with a documented history of manipulation and harm appears to change, the people around them face an unsolvable epistemic problem. They cannot verify the change from the outside, and they cannot afford to trust it without verification. The ambiguity is intentional and psychologically sophisticated. In real life, when someone with a history of severe antisocial behavior appears to change, the people around them face exactly this dilemma. Is the change genuine? Can they trust it? Should they let their guard down? And there is no reliable way to answer these questions definitively, because the skills that allowed the person to manipulate others in the past are the same skills that would allow them to convincingly fake transformation. The people who know Cartman best are the people least capable of trusting his change, because they have the most evidence that trusting him is dangerous. This creates a closed loop where change, even if genuine, cannot be verified by the people who matter most. If Cartman truly changed, Kyle would be the last person to believe it, because Kyle has the longest and most detailed record of Cartman's lies. And if Cartman is faking it, Kyle's suspicion is the thing that eventually forces the mask to drop. Either way, the relationship between them, the history of manipulation and justified distrust, makes genuine reconciliation functionally impossible. The show's exploration of change in Cartman is not nihilistic, though. It's not saying change is impossible in some cosmic sense. It's saying that change requires sustained environmental support, genuine therapeutic intervention, consistent consequences for harmful behavior, and a community that can hold the changed individual accountable while also giving them room to be different. And none of those conditions exist in Cartman's world. His mother won't change, his peers can't trust him, the institutions around him don't function. And so the theoretical possibility of change remains just that, theoretical, while the practical reality remains stuck in the same cycles it's been in since the pilot episode. There's something genuinely tragic about this, even for a character as reprehensible as Cartman. He is trapped not by fate or by some immutable feature of his character, but by the same forces that trap real people with similar profiles. Inadequate parenting, failed institutions, social environments that accommodate rather than challenge harmful behavior, and the self-reinforcing nature of personality patterns that make it progressively harder to break free the longer they persist. The clinical literature puts numbers on this trajectory. Approximately 25 to 40% of children with conduct disorder develop ASPD as adults, which means that 60 to 75% don't. The majority of children with conduct problems do not become adult antisocial individuals. Something intervenes, something changes. A teacher, a mentor, a program, a crisis that leads to treatment, a relationship that provides the security the family never did. Something breaks the cycle. But that something requires other people acting effectively and consistently, and in Cartman's world, nobody does. The show has occasionally depicted characters other than Cartman undergoing genuine growth. Butters Stotch, who is frequently Cartman's victim and enabler, develops a quiet resilience over the course of the series. Stan Marsh goes through a period of genuine depression in season 15 that the show takes seriously as a psychological condition rather than playing purely for laughs. Kyle's faith is tested repeatedly, and his responses evolve over time. These characters change because the show gives them the conditions for change, even imperfect ones. Cartman is the character for whom those conditions are never provided, and the show is honest about the results. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. After examining all of these aspects of Cartman's psychology, from his personality traits to his family dynamics to his relationships to his capacity for change, we can now step back and ask the larger question: what does all of this teach us about real human psychology and about the world we actually live in? After spending this entire video examining Eric Cartman through the lens of clinical psychology, personality research, developmental theory, and specific episode analysis, we can step back and ask what this fictional 10-year-old actually teaches us about real human behavior and about the world we navigate every day. Because the value of analyzing a fictional character this closely isn't in the analysis itself. It's in what the analysis reveals about patterns that exist outside the fiction, in workplaces and families and relationships and communities where the same dynamics play out in less extreme but equally real forms. The first and perhaps most important lesson from Cartman's psychology is that environment creates pathology. This is not a controversial statement in clinical psychology. It's one of the most well-established findings in the field. But it's a finding that people resist accepting because it complicates the satisfying narrative that bad people are simply born bad and that their badness is an intrinsic quality that exists independently of circumstance. Cartman was not born a monster, he was shaped into one. He was shaped by a mother who provided unlimited indulgence and zero boundaries, whose parenting style has been specifically linked by multiple peer-reviewed studies to the development of narcissistic traits in children. He was shaped by the absence of a father, which research consistently associates with increased behavioral problems in boys. He was shaped by institutions that failed to identify or address his escalating conduct problems despite having decades of opportunity to do so. And he was shaped by a peer group that accommodated his behavior rather than excluding him from social participation. Every one of these factors has real-world parallels, and every one of them is, at least theoretically, modifiable. Permissive parenting can be addressed through parent training programs. Father absence can be partially mitigated through mentoring and community support. Institutional failures can be corrected through better training, better funding, and better screening protocols. And peer dynamics can be shifted through the kind of social-emotional learning programs that many schools have implemented in recent years with varying degrees of success. The point is not that fixing these factors is easy, it's that they are factors, not destiny. The Caesar Millan episode demonstrated this clearly. When the environmental conditions changed, Cartman changed. The change didn't stick because the environmental change didn't stick, but the possibility was real. And this is an important message for anyone who works with children, who parents children, who teaches children, or who makes policy decisions about children. The trajectory that Cartman represents, from childhood conduct disorder to adult antisocial personality disorder, is not inevitable. It's a probability that can be reduced through appropriate intervention. But the intervention has to target the environment, not just the individual, because individual change without environmental change is like planting a seed in toxic soil and wondering why it doesn't grow. The second lesson is that intelligence in service of dysfunction is still dysfunction. Cartman is smart, genuinely smart. His schemes demonstrate planning ability, strategic thinking, social awareness, and an understanding of human psychology that would be impressive if it were directed toward constructive ends. He can read people, predict their behavior, and construct elaborate plans that account for multiple variables and contingencies. In the Scott Tenorman episode, his plan required anticipating at least 4 separate human decision points, and he got every single one right. But this intelligence hasn't made him successful in any meaningful sense. It hasn't made him happy. It hasn't earned him genuine respect or real friendship. It hasn't given his life purpose or direction. His intelligence is deployed exclusively in service of manipulation, revenge, self-aggrandizement, and the avoidance of consequences. It's a spectacular engine pulling a train to nowhere. This is something that deserves more attention than it typically gets in our culture because we tend to treat intelligence as inherently valuable regardless of how it's used. We admire cleverness, we reward strategic thinking. We celebrate people who outsmart the system, even when what they're outsmarting the system to do is harmful. Cartman's character challenges this assumption by showing us what pure strategic intelligence looks like when it's completely divorced from empathy, moral reasoning, and genuine human connection. It looks impressive from the outside and empty from the inside. and it leaves a trail of destruction that the intelligent person themselves may never fully comprehend, because their intelligence doesn't extend to the domain of self-awareness. The research supports this distinction. Studies on the dark triad have found that Machiavellian intelligence, the ability to manipulate others for personal gain, is not associated with general intelligence in the way people assume. Some individuals who score high on Machiavellianism are highly intelligent by conventional measures. Others are average or below average. What they share is not raw cognitive ability, but a specific kind of social cognition, an understanding of what motivates people and how to exploit those motivations. This social cognition can coexist with profound deficits in emotional intelligence, self-awareness, and moral reasoning. Cartman is a perfect illustration of this dissociation. He understands other people brilliantly. He understands himself not at all. The third lesson, and this is one that I think is particularly valuable for people who have dealt with narcissistic or antisocial individuals in their own lives, is that the victim narrative is the single most powerful manipulation tool in the arsenal. Kyle's observation in the Heidi arc that Cartman always sees himself as the victim is the show's most psychologically incisive insight, and it applies far beyond the world of South Park. In real-world psychology, the tendency of individuals with narcissistic and antisocial traits to cast themselves as victims has been extensively documented. When confronted with the consequences of their behavior, these individuals don't typically accept responsibility. They reframe the situation so that they are the wrong party. The person who confronts them becomes the aggressor. The consequences they face become persecution. The harm they cause becomes a justified response to some prior offense, real or imagined, that nobody else remembers or recognizes. This is incredibly effective as a manipulation strategy because it hijacks the empathy of the people around them. When someone tells you they're being victimized, your natural human response is compassion. You want to help. You want to understand. You want to give them the benefit of the doubt. And narcissistic individuals exploit this compassionate impulse ruthlessly. They know that claiming victimhood generates sympathy, support, and protection. They know that the person who questions a victim's narrative looks like a bully. And they use this knowledge to insulate themselves from accountability. Cartman does this constantly and shamelessly. When Heidi confronts him about his behavior, he reframes himself as the victim of her demands. When Kyle challenges his schemes, Cartman positions himself as the person being unfairly persecuted by Kyle's jealousy or rigidity. When the school attempts to discipline him, he's the child being oppressed by a system that doesn't understand him. The content of the victimhood claim changes, but the function is always the same. It deflects responsibility and recruits sympathy from bystanders who haven't seen enough of the pattern to recognize what's happening. The practical takeaway from this is simple but important. When someone consistently positions themselves as the victim in situations where they are demonstrably the cause of harm, that inconsistency is meaningful. It doesn't automatically mean they're a narcissist or that every claim of victimhood is manipulative, but it does mean the pattern deserves scrutiny rather than automatic sympathy. And recognizing this pattern can protect you from being recruited into someone else's narrative in ways that enable their harmful behavior while blinding you to the harm they're causing. The fourth lesson is about proximity. Heidi Turner's transformation across season 21 demonstrates something that researchers have documented in the study of abusive relationships, which is that sustained proximity to individuals with dark triad traits changes you. You don't remain the same person you were when the relationship started. The constant exposure to manipulation, gaslighting, blame shifting, and emotional control gradually erodes your own psychological foundations. You start doubting your perceptions. You start accepting treatment you would have found unacceptable at the beginning. You start adjusting your behavior to manage the other person's moods rather than living according to your own values and preferences. Heidi started as a kind, intelligent, confident girl. By the end of her relationship with Cartman, she was angry, hostile, overweight from his deliberate deception and adopting his behavioral patterns. She had become, in a meaningful sense, more like him. Not because she chose to, but because his influence was a corrosive force that broke down her existing personality and replaced it with something that more closely matched his worldview. This is not a metaphor. This is something that actually happens to people in relationships with individuals who have severe narcissistic or antisocial traits. The clinical term for the psychological impact on people who have been in prolonged relationships with narcissistic individuals varies, but the symptoms are consistent: difficulty trusting your own perceptions, chronic self-doubt, difficulty making decisions, a sense that your own personality has been lost or overwritten, emotional exhaustion, and in some cases, the adoption of the very behaviors that were used against you, because after long enough exposure, those behaviors start to feel normal. The practical lesson is about protecting your own psychological integrity when dealing with people whose behavior shows the patterns we've been discussing. Distance is not optional in these situations, it's necessary. The idea that you can maintain a close relationship with someone like Cartman without being changed by that relationship is a comforting illusion that the show thoroughly debunks through Heidi's experience. The fifth lesson is perhaps the broadest and most uncomfortable one, which is that systems, not just individuals, produce people like Cartman. The show's deepest argument, sustained across decades of storytelling, is that Cartman is not an anomaly, he is a product. He is what you get when you combine permissive parenting with absent authority figures, with ineffective institutions, with peer groups that tolerate abuse, with a society that rewards manipulation and punishes vulnerability. None of those conditions are unique to South Park. Every community in the real world contains some version of each of them. The parents who can't or won't set boundaries, the schools that don't have the resources to address behavioral problems effectively, the friend groups that keep inviting the person who treats everyone badly because excluding them feels mean or confrontational, the workplaces that promote the charming manipulator over the quiet, competent worker because the manipulator is better at managing impressions. Addressing the Cartman problem at a societal level requires more than identifying and treating individual pathology. It requires examining and modifying the systems that produce and maintain that pathology. It requires asking uncomfortable questions about parenting practices, about institutional capacity, about social norms around conflict avoidance, and about the cultural values that reward certain kinds of harmful behavior while punishing the people who try to call it out. Kyle is the character who most consistently tries to call out Cartman's behavior, and the show repeatedly demonstrates that being the person who says something is wrong comes with social costs. Kyle is mocked, ignored, and excluded when he pushes back against Cartman. His moral clarity doesn't earn him respect, it earns him isolation. And this mirrors real-world dynamics where the person who names the problem is often treated worse than the person causing the problem, because naming the problem disrupts the social equilibrium that everyone else has invested in maintaining. The sixth lesson is about the relationship between past trauma and present behavior. And it's a lesson that requires holding two apparently contradictory ideas in your mind at the same time. The show hints, without confirming, that Cartman's pathology may be rooted in genuine psychological damage, his father's absence, his mother's inability to parent effectively, the instability and inconsistency of his early environment. These are real risk factors for the development of the kinds of traits Cartman displays, and acknowledging them doesn't excuse his behavior but does explain it. Understanding the origin of someone's harmful behavior is not the same as condoning that behavior. You can recognize that a person's cruelty was shaped by circumstances they didn't choose without concluding that their cruelty is therefore acceptable. And you can insist on accountability for harmful behavior while also acknowledging that the person engaging in it may themselves be a casualty of forces they didn't create. This is the nuance the show maintains with Cartman. He is simultaneously a perpetrator and a product. He does terrible things and he was shaped by terrible conditions. Both of these statements are true. Neither one cancels the other. And holding both of them in mind simultaneously is more psychologically mature and more practically useful than choosing one and discarding the other. The seventh lesson is about the stubborn persistence of human emotional needs, even in people who appear to have transcended them. Cartman claims not to need other people. He claims to be beyond the petty concerns of friendship and connection and belonging. He mocks people who express vulnerability. He dismisses emotional needs as weakness. And yet his behavior consistently reveals that he has all the same needs as anyone else. He wants to be included. He wants to be admired. He wants to be loved. He keeps coming back to the same group of friends despite claiming to despise them. He enters a romantic relationship. He grieves when he's excluded. His denial of these needs doesn't eliminate them. It just ensures that they're never met in healthy ways. He can't ask for connection directly because asking is vulnerable, and vulnerability is unacceptable. So he pursues connection through manipulation, through coercion, through schemes that get him close to people without requiring him to admit that closeness is what he wants. And the result is that he's always surrounded by people and always alone because the manipulative version of closeness he's capable of producing is not the same as genuine connection, and both he and the people around him know it. This is the fundamental tragedy of Cartman's character, and it's the fundamental tragedy of real people who share his psychological profile. They need the same things everyone needs: love, connection, respect, belonging. But their methods of pursuing those things are so distorted by their pathology that they consistently produce the opposite results. They push people away by trying to control them. They lose trust by trying to manipulate it into existence. They destroy relationships by trying to dominate them. And they end up isolated and miserable in a way that confirms their original suspicion that other people can't be relied on, which strengthens the defensive patterns that caused the isolation in the first place. Looking at Cartman's psychology across the entire run of the series teaches us that living well, whether as an individual or as a society, requires balancing different human needs even when those needs appear to contradict each other. We need boundaries and we need connection. We need accountability and we need compassion. We need to protect ourselves from harmful people, and we need to understand how harmful people are made. We need institutions that can contain dangerous behavior, and we need communities that can support genuine change. Cartman is what happens when every one of these balance points tips the wrong way. Unlimited freedom with no accountability. Unlimited indulgence with no structure. Unlimited intelligence with no wisdom. Unlimited desire with no capacity for satisfaction. The show doesn't offer solutions because solutions would require a level of systemic change that a half-hour animated comedy can't depict. What it offers instead is diagnosis. It identifies the factors, it demonstrates the mechanisms, it shows the consequences. And then it leaves us, the audience, to decide what to do with that information in our own lives and our own communities. Cartman endures as a character because he is uncomfortable to recognize. Not because he is alien, not because he's a fantastical creation with no real-world counterpart, but because the traits he exaggerates for comedy exist in smaller and less dramatic forms in the world around us. In the co-worker who takes credit for other people's work while playing the victim when confronted. In the partner who reframes every conflict so they're never at fault. In the parent who gives their child everything except the structure and boundaries the child actually needs. In the institution that accommodates harmful behavior because addressing it would be inconvenient. Eric Cartman is a 10-year-old cartoon character who weighs too much and says terrible things in a screechy voice. He is also one of the most accurate psychological portraits in the history of popular culture. And the fact that we laugh at him, the fact that he is genuinely one of the funniest characters ever created, doesn't diminish the accuracy, it enhances it. Because the laughter is part of the mechanism. It's the safe distance that allows us to look at something true without having to admit that we're looking at ourselves. Trey Parker has been writing this character for over 25 years across more than 300 episodes. And in all that time, Cartman hasn't changed. He's gotten smarter. He's gotten more dangerous. He's been given opportunities to be different and has rejected every single one. But the fundamental architecture of his personality, the narcissism, the Machiavellianism, the psychopathic detachment, the buried humanity that surfaces only to be extinguished, that architecture has remained consistent from the beginning. And maybe that consistency is the show's final and most important psychological insight. Some patterns, once they're deeply enough entrenched, resist change with a force that individual willpower and good intentions can't overcome. Not because change is impossible in theory, but because the conditions for change are so demanding and so sustained that they rarely exist in practice. The gap between what's theoretically possible and what actually happens is where Cartman lives. It's where a lot of people with his profile live. Understanding that gap, understanding why it exists and what it would take to close it, is the beginning of something that might actually help. Not help Cartman specifically because he's a fictional character whose pathology serves the show's narrative purposes too well to ever be resolved, but help the real people who recognize pieces of Cartman in people they know, in people they've been hurt by, or in patterns they've noticed in themselves. Psychology is, at its core, the study of why people do what they do. And Eric Cartman, for all his absurdity and cruelty and comedy, is one of the richest subjects that study has ever produced. He's a case study in a red jacket and a blue hat, and 28 seasons in, we're still learning from him. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.